So thanks, Mark. Yeah, I could acknowledge the same people as well. Co-authors are pretty much a carbon copy of what Mark just presented. Most of all, I think I'd like to acknowledge Renata Tarosky and Travis Schill, who are both in the room. They're the ones who were hoofing an electrofisher up and down slopes that look like this in the char and whatnot in the hot summer months to collect some of the data we're going to look at today. So, for my talk today, I'm going to give you a brief just overview. First off, I'm going to talk a little bit about water typing, which is kind of a regulatory survey thing that we do in the forestry industry that made this work possible from a research perspective. I'll give you some context for this work also from both the research and the regulatory perspective. I'll talk about our objectives and kind of what we expected to see going into this work. I'll talk about our study sites and methods, some preliminary analysis that we've done, and then some next steps because we're far from being done right now. So water typing, what is it? It's essentially a systematic classification for delineating streams on the landscape as either fish-bearing, type F, or non-fish-bearing, type N. And it's done typically via backpack electrofishing. You send crews out in the spring, they shock the streams, they identify the uppermost point of fish use, they monument that, they document that, and then we do it because that information is then used to inform forestry operations on the landscape, because riparian buffer prescriptions are largely dependent on whether a stream is type F or type N. And it also informs how we put in roads. Do we need to allow for fish passage or not? So that's the 30-second high overview of what water typing is. In terms of context for the work and the research work that we're doing, first off, the area impacted by that Holiday Farm fire that Mark was just talking about just happened to be, fortuitously, one of the areas in Oregon where we knew the most about things like stream temperature and fish distribution on the Weyerhaeuser landscape going into the fires. Again, as Mark pointed out, that was simply fortuitous. We couldn't have planned for that. Secondly, most of the published research that's out there on impacts of fire and disturbance on fish and fish populations is focused on just that, fish populations and biomass and density. And you saw some great examples of really good work that's being done by David and Brooke earlier today, speaking to just those things. The work that we're doing here is solely focused on distribution of fish on the landscape. We didn't do density estimates, we weren't interested in biomass, we were just interested in where those fish were on the landscape and how high up into these systems they persisted, both before and after the fire. And then lastly, this, because of the information that we had from water typing going into the fire event, this just gave us a really unique opportunity to characterize these impacts in the recovery process at multiple spatial scales over time. And lastly, it's worth noting there's a regulatory component to this work as well. This is, I know we're in Oregon, I'm from Washington, and this is from the Washington Forest Practices Board Manual. And this is a very common theme as it relates to forestry. So this, the manual reads that fish populations may be locally or temporarily extirpated from streams or from stream channels due to disturbance events that can require years before even partial recovery begins. And so, the question at hand is, okay, where we see these disturbance events, where we have debris torrents or fires or whatever the disturbance event may be, can we still rely on things like water typing and fish surveys to accurately reflect fish distribution on the landscape so that we can, put our forestry operations in appropriately? So this slide just gives you an idea of what that burn severity looked like in that Holiday Farm area, kind of at different scales. Right on the upper left, you see an entire watershed. Again, those are the hills. Those guys are going up and down with the electrofisher. Upper right, you see the intact riparian area down at the valley bottom that was burned. And then this photo, I think this one's my favorite one actually, because Travis, I'm pretty sure, is like right in here somewhere. He's got the electrofisher on his back, so that's what it looks like within that riparian area. And then this last photo on the lower right is taken from within one of those riparian areas where we're sampling. And I put this up because as we went into this work, as 2020 concluded, and as we went into our first year of kind of recovery sampling in 2021, we had very definitive expectations of what we would see. Given what we saw on the landscape, our hypothesis was, we're going to see that these fish have been largely extirpated from most of the habitats where we knew they had been and knew that they occupied pre-fire. So that's kind of how we went into this thing in the beginning. So to get at that, we had multiple research objectives. One was to assess the direct impact of the Holiday Farm fire on fish distributions and relate that back to burn severity. And so we were specifically interested in 2021, spring 2021 fish distribution and how that related to burn severity from 2020. We were interested also in the short-term impacts. So we were looking at 2022 fish distribution and relating that back to summer stream temperatures from 2021. We were also interested in investigating how changes in fish distribution that we saw within the Holiday Farm fire footprint aligned with or related to patterns of natural variability that we tend to see in other work. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that other work later in the talk. And then lastly, still to come, and Mark talked about this a little bit, that this work isn't done, right? We're also going to assess longer-term impacts in the Holiday Farm fire footprint on fish distribution as it relates to summer stream temperature in the years moving forward, potential debris torrents or debris flows, if we get those impacting some of those streams and whatnot. This is, okay, so coincidentally, we also had 24 sites. Brooke had 24 sites. They're not the same sites. And then Mark talked about 21 sites where he did the temperature monitoring in the footprint. While both fell within that Holiday Farm fire footprint, they weren't the same sites. The sites that Mark talked about is where they had pre-fire temperature information on those 21. What we had in our 24 sites was where we had fish distribution pre-fire. So I'm not going to get into the burn severity map. I feel like you've seen that enough times. But the blue points are our survey point locations, and the white polygons that you see around those points are simply delineations of the watershed. The take home is it burned hot, and it burned a lot. And that's pretty obvious when you look at the burn severity map. So our field methods are pretty simple. Mark talked about the fact that we instrumented a number of new points within the footprint of the fire with temperature installs post-fire, our 24 sites being some of those. So we dropped hobos in at the previously documented upper extent of fish distribution points. We'd go back in the spring of every year, so far 21 and 22, we'll be back in the spring of 23, conducting resurveys on fish distribution using the same basic techniques, the electrofishing techniques that were used for the original operational support survey. Where we see a distance of change in that uppermost fish point location, we measure that, we monument that on the ground. And then we also document and categorize stream habitat characteristics at that new uppermost fish location if and when it changes. So this map's a little bit easier to see our 24 points. The yellow color on the map represents the intersection of the Holiday Farm fire footprint and Weyerhaeuser ownership, and that's where all of our points fall. So again, there's 24 points in green, and those represent the pre-fire end of fish distribution points. And you know, there's not much you could see. If I were to visually represent changes in fish distribution here, you wouldn't see much. So what I'll do for the purposes of the conversation is we'll focus in on a smaller geographic area here, which is Gate Creek, a small section of that whole area. And within this area, you've got 5 points, and those again are represented by those green points. So these are the pre-fire uppermost fish distribution points. It wasn't necessarily the year before the fire, but it was always before fire at some point, where we had good information on fish distribution. So this represents pre-fire. The yellow line represents measured distribution or upper extent of distribution in 2021. And that red line and those red points represent what we saw in 2022. And again, to our surprise, what we found was we didn't see big shifts in fish distribution pre-fire to post-fire. We did see some small changes, and if you focus in on site 5 there on the right-hand side of the panel, what you see is, again, there's your pre-fire point. 2021, we came in and fish were 235 or so feet downstream of that original point. And then in 2022, another 350 feet downstream from that, a total of 587 feet down from the initial point. So it's not that we didn't see change anywhere, but it was really about the pattern of change or the lack of pattern in change over the extent of where we did our sampling. So if you think back, I talked about the objectives of the research. One of our main objectives was to correlate or try to correlate change in fish distribution with that burn severity, and that's what is plotted here. You've got watershed percent burn on the x-axis, and then change on the y-axis with anything below the horizontal line being a negative or downstream change, and anything above that horizontal line at 0 being an upstream change. And the reality is, while there is a lot more scatter and a little bit more variability on the upper end of that graph, there's no real discernible pattern or definitive pattern in effect on burn severity. Similarly, we were interested in the impact of 2021 summer stream temperatures because we knew there would be a lot more light getting to those streams. We expected to see the elevated stream temperatures. And we wondered if that, in turn, would have an impact on fish distribution subsequently. And we didn't see a pattern there either. Same basic presentation here with the maximum stream temperature data from 2021 on the x-axis and fish distribution information on the y-axis. So if we flip that and we just look to summarize the fish distribution information in this figure and in the next few figures, what we're going to have here is patterns of fish distribution information or distances from the original last fish location on the x-axis and simple count on the y-axis. This represents the data from both 2021 and 2022. And as you can see, it's fairly normally distributed. Most of the points fall at 0, which means in most of the cases, most of the places that we sampled, fish just didn't move. The upper extent of fish distribution occurred at the same location where fish were found pre-fire. I always want to reiterate, and I'll point it out here, that these were not randomly selected sites from the landscape. This was a complete census of points where we had that pre-fire distribution information on the landscape, but nevertheless, the pattern is pretty clear that it's fairly normally distributed data. If you look at those summary statistics, sure, we did see some change in some places. You know, the maximum change downstream was 675 feet, the maximum upstream change was 313 feet, but on average, the upper extent of fish distribution just didn't change a lot, right? 93 feet down, 73 feet down in 2022. That slight shift in the downstream directions, if you think about this, perfect. If you think about it from just a logical standpoint, that makes sense because in a lot of these cases, and this is Travis, again, right here, but in some of these cases, or a lot of these cases, there really isn't an opportunity for upstream change in fish distribution, right? When you got a fish pushing up against a bedrock feature like a cascade like this one, they could move downstream, but odds are they're not going to move upstream, and there's quite a few sites that meet this kind of criteria out there. I also talked about the fact with our third objective that I wanted to compare what we saw within the Holiday Farm fire footprint with what we've seen in other studies. We've got a paper in prep right now looking at variability rates around that uppermost fish point at about, in this case, what's presented here, 94 sites in Washington. This is variability from one year to the next, just after 1 year. And we see that same basic pattern of distribution, very normally distributed data, slight shift downstream. And if you look at the summary statistics for what I've got here, it's the same basic thing, right? You do have some variability, right? A few sites way down here, a few sites where they've moved way up, but on average, that uppermost point isn't moving much. And if you put up the summary statistics from the sites within the Holiday Farm fire, you'll notice that those values fall within the range of natural variability that we're presenting in the upcoming manuscript. So, in summary, we didn't really see any direct or definitive impact on burn severity as it related to 2021 fish distribution. Really didn't see a definitive or a definite signal of the impact of water temperature in 2021 on 2022 fish distribution. The changes that we did see tend to fall within the rates of like natural variability, I guess you could say, that we're looking to present in that Walter et al. Paper here pretty soon. And we're going to continue to do sampling to assess potential longer-term stuff as it relates to both stream temperature and potential slope stability events. And I'm kind of excited to see some of those talks tomorrow. I added this in this morning. Shameless plug. We are hiring, so if you're into doing this sort of work, this job is actually flown right now. Travis, back of the room. He's running the hiring process for here, but if you want to try the electrofishing, do fish work, do water work with us, this is about an 9 month gig, and we are hiring for it right now, so you can talk to me, and I can introduce you to Travis, but there's my email. So shameless plug on that, and with that, I think Mark and I can take questions.
I have a question on the rest of the story. Jason, you mentioned that that you kind of were doing this to look to see if it was an F stream or an N stream. So I'm not familiar, I'm more familiar with the management on federal land, but if you find that the distribution would decrease, do you change your management, or do you assume it would go back to the pre-fire levels at some point?
No, that's a great question, and I wasn't sure what the familiarity was with water typing in this venue, and that's why I gave that real brief description. But no, for the purposes of water typing, once it's F, it's always F. I mean, that's just how. I mean, yeah, one fish at one point in time, it defaults to F downstream, and it stays that way. So, no, you wouldn't change it just because of the variable. We're not looking to like pull those points back downstream at all. No, it stays that way. Yeah, the points can always move up. They can never move down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you already answered one of my questions, was how does the variability in the end of fish distribution, just vary naturally? But I wondered if you had reference sites that were looked at that same year, that you could look at end of fish distribution for the variability for that particular year. And the reason I'm asking that is I'm wondering if there's something particular about the climate, for example, that might be pushing heterogeneity in fish distribution or water flow. And do you know what might be the drivers of heterogeneity?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a really good question. We don't have any specific reference sites on the fish side for the Holiday Farm fire. What I can say is that the variability work that we did in Washington occurred over the course of 5 years, 5 separate water years. And we've looked at, any potential effects of individual water year or calendar year on those patterns, and we're not seeing any, and that'll be included in the manuscript as well. I just didn't have time to get into that today.
Yeah.
So,
all right, thank you.
yeah, you bet. Ask him stuff.
So did you come across any commonalities as far as the upstream extent? So I'm thinking, groundwater, surface water, or pools, or something that would sort of make the fish stop?
I mean, that's in terms of, I just want to, for clarification purposes, are you talking about with the resurveys that we're conducting now, or are you talking about with the original surveys that we base those points on, or both, or? Either. It's a little bit of a smorgasbord when it comes to fish distribution, right? I mean, in the Cascades, you tend to have a lot of uppermost points defined by changes in gradient or barrier features, like you saw that photo of Travis, just because of the hard nature of that landscape and the lithology. As you get more into the Coast Range, you tend to see, lower gradient systems where size becomes a lot more of a predicting variable, and streams just peter out and they lack the pool habitat. So it's really variable, but it's largely dependent on geography and where you are in the landscape.
Hi guys, sorry, I'm gonna grill you again, Jason. I'm curious, what were your hypotheses about the changes in fish distribution? That because the temperatures are already so low in the headwaters, you wouldn't think that temperature would drive the end of fish. It would be something like a debris flow or like a mass wasting event. Were you thinking that would be what would be driving the fish distribution to go downstream? Because they're normally confined by like a big, like a huge bedrock feature or something.
Well, personally, I just felt like, I'm sorry, they're talking to the mic, so I'm good, right? So personally, I just felt like, given what we saw on the landscape, and this, we generated our hypotheses around fish distribution before we knew what those temperature data looked like. And so our hypothesis going in was, wow, these things cooked. And I can't speak for Brooke, but I would assume you maybe thought some of the same things when you looked at what that landscape looked like that you sampled in, that, it doesn't take but one day at, above lethal temperatures to extirpate a population from a small stream. And I think that's the key, is like a lot of these systems that we're working in at the upper extent of fish distribution, these are small streams. They're not the large systems like Brooke showed in her photo where it's a 20-foot wide channel. We're talking about 3-foot wide channels, 5-foot wide channels that are really much more connected to the upslope processes because of how small they are. And so we hypothesized that we would just see the fact that, okay, the fire went through, got super hot, cooked the fish out, and now they have to work their way back. That's what we thought was going to happen. And then Mark presented the temperature data to us and was like, oh, well, maybe not. maybe not, that's not what we're going to see just because of the nature of what the temperature information looked like. But we didn't have it when we generated those points, and I think I answered that, but.
Yeah, thanks. I know the paper that we worked on, we found that stream temperature didn't change all that much during the fire, which was such a shock. I mean, when you're in a stream channel that's like a meter wide, you'd think that you'd get a lot of just like thermal loading in that time. But we didn't see anything above 19C. So, yeah. It was,
Yeah. We did, I just brought up this slide here because we did have 4 sites that did have the 7-day average max over 20, and David alluded to that's sometimes a number that is in people's heads that, a real stress point for fish. But, even here, the fish didn't move much. In fact, the hottest site, they were right where they were in the pre-survey. But I think it was just more of seeing the landscape, like you mentioned, you out there, and you just, don't see much for shade, and you just think, gosh, surely there aren't fish up in here. Are they where they were before? So I think that's more what Jason was alluding to with that. Thank you.
Thank you.